Sponsored by Rabbi Shlomi and Mirala Greenwald. This is a Sicha from Likutei Sichos, Chelek Yud, Parshas Vayigash, Sicha Alef, and the topic of the Sicha is that in this week's Parsha, we learn how Yosef and Binyamin cried on each other's necks, and Chazal tell us that they were crying over the destruction of the Mikdashos in each of their portions in the land of Eretz Yisrael. And there are four parts in the Sicha. The Rebbe will, number one, explain why the mikdashes are alluded to in the neck and not the head. Number two, explain why they didn't cry on their own mikdashes. Why did they cry in each other's and not their own? And also, why Yaakov didn't cry in the mikdashes at all. Number three, explain how Aveda can help even after the decree that the mikdashes would be destroyed. Aveda could help to remove that decree. And number four, present the Hira in Avedas Hashem. On the pasuk, Vayipel al Tzavare Binyamin Achi Vayefk, and he Yosef fell on the neck of Binyamin his brother and cried. Ubinyamin Bacha al Tzavarav, and Binyamin cried on his neck. So it says in Gemara, Bacha Yosef al Shnei Mikdashin Sha'asidin Liyes Bechelki Shel Binyamin V'asidin Lecharev. That Yosef cried on the two Mikdashes that were destined to be in the portion of land in Eretz Yisrael that would be given to Binyamin, and that would later in the future be destroyed. Ubinyamin bacha al mishkan shiloi she'asid liyes bechelka shel Yosef va'asid lecharev. And Binyamin cried for Mishkan Shiloi that was destined to be in the portion of land of Eretz Yisrael that would be given to Yosef, and that would later in the future be destroyed. Now it's explained in the Medrash on the pasuk of Kimigdal David Savarech. It's explained over there the reason Savare alludes to the Beis Hamikdash, and the Medrash says, "Mat Savar zeh nosen begavish al adam." Just like this neck is placed in the height of a person, so Kach Beis Hamikdash nosen begavish al olam. So too the Beis Hamikdash is placed in the height of the world. However, when it says begavai, it doesn't mean that it's higher than the whole world, but rather, like it's explained in the Gemara on the pasuk of Ubein Kseif of Shachin, that he rests between its shoulders, which is where the neck is, that the Beis Hamikdash was actually 23 amos lower than Ein Etam. So it wasn't the highest place, it was 23 amos lower than the highest place. And this is like the neck of a person, which is in the height of the body, but is lower than the head. And Adarabba, to the contrary, there's an advantage to this. Like it says over there in the Gemara, Amri, they said, Nachsi bei Pursa, let us lower it a little bit from the highest point, Mishum dichsiv, because it's written, Ubein kseif of shachin, it rests between the shoulders, Ein lechana bashar, Yeiser mikseif. There's nothing better in the axe than between its shoulders. And so when it says, Begavei shal olam, it doesn't mean that it's in the actual highest place, but it means like Besoich Gavei, within the Gavish Al the highest place in the world. It's within it, but not actually the highest place itself. And so that's the reason why the neck alludes to the Beis Hamikdash, because both of them are B'Seich Gavei. They're closest to the highest place. One in the person, the neck, and the Beis Hamikdash, close to the highest place in the world. And there's a difficulty over here, and that is, l'cha'era, what is the greatness and beauty of not being at the very highest point? We said it's not the highest point, it's b'soich gavish al it's within the highest point, but not actually the highest point itself. Memanav shach, no matter how we look at it, there's a difficulty here. If there isn't a greatness in being high, so then what is the Medrash teaching us with this, that the Beis Hamikdash was nasan begavish al it's within the height of the world? If being high is not a greatness and there's nothing special in it, then why does the Medrash tell it to us? And if on the other hand there is a greatness in being high, as it seems from what it says in the Medrash, that the Beis Hamikdash is nasan begavish al so then the higher the better. So why was the Beis Hamikdash 23 amos lower than Ein Etam? Why wasn't it at the very highest point? In order to answer this question, we need to first explain what is the inyan, what is the idea of the neck, and based on that understanding, we'll be able to answer our question. So this is now a lead up to the answer. So this will be understood by first explaining the inyan of the neck, the idea of the neck, which the neck is an intermediate between the head and the body, and it's an intermediate for two things. Number one, the general chayas, the general life force, is found in the brain and the head, and it's drawn down to the body through the trachea, esophagus, and arteries that are in the neck. And number two, the same is true regarding drawing down the intellect from the brain and the head, that the way the intellect goes to the heart is through the meitzer shabagarin, the constriction in the throat, which is in the neck. So we see that the neck is an intermediate between the head and the body for two things, and it seems like these two things, one of them is more physical and one of them is more spiritual. The more physical one is the general chayas, the general life force, and the more spiritual one is the intellect, the mind, controlling the rest of the body. So it comes out that there's an advantage in the neck even over the head, because it's specifically the neck that actualizes the purpose of the head, which is that all the limbs should get their chayas, they should get their life force from the head, and that all the limbs should all conduct themselves according to the intellect. Now, even though the greatness of the head on its own is greater than the greatness of the neck on its own, and that's the very reason why the head is physically higher than the neck, but nevertheless, this greatness of the head over the neck is only in the hierarchy of the levels. When you look at the hierarchy of the levels, the head is greater than the neck. However, regarding the purpose and mission of the head, so then there's a greatness to the neck, and that greatness is actually specifically because it's on a lower level. That's why it's able to serve as an intermediate, because it's lower. So because it's lower in the hierarchy of the levels, therefore there's a greatness to the neck over the head. That the neck is the intermediate, and it has the ability to bring the chayas and intellect from the head to the body. According to this explanation about the neck, we could now answer our question about why the Beis Hamikdash was not at the very highest point of the world, but it was close to the highest point of the world. So similarly, it will be understood regarding the Beis Hamikdash, which is compared to the neck, that its main greatness is nachsi bei porsa, from the highest point, that it was a little lower than the highest point, just like the neck is lower than the head. The inyan of the Beis Hamikdash is that through it, through the Beis Hamikdash, the Eir Liki is drawn down and shines to the whole world, even the lowest of places in the world. And therefore, the Beis Hamikdash wasn't completely higher and elevated from the world. It wasn't removed from the world. Because then, if it would be higher and elevated from the world, completely higher and elevated from the world, then it would be too high to bring down and shine from it, the Eir Liki, into the world. But rather, Nachas Porsa, it was lowered a little bit, meaning that it's connected and close to the world, so that it's able to shine into the world. So that's why the Beis Hamikdash was within the height of the world, but not at the very highest point, because the role of the Beis Hamikdash is to bring down the Eir Liki into the world. And in order to accomplish that, it has to have some closeness to the world. It can't be entirely removed from the world. And so that's why it's similar to the neck and not the head, because the head is completely removed from the person, and the neck is what brings down the general life force, the general chayas, as well as the seichel, the intellect, into the body. And that's also the role of the Beis Hamikdash, to bring down the Eir Liki into the world, and so it has to be close to the world. And the same is true by the individual Beis Hamikdash in each and every yid. When the nefesh elokis in a person isn't in a state of being elevated from one's own olam katan, because each person is considered an olam katan, a small world. So when the nefesh elokis in a person isn't in a state of being removed and elevated from one's olam katan, like the head is, but rather it deals with it in order to be mevarer or mezakech, to refine and uplift the nefesh bahamas, which is in the person, and the body, and one's part in the world, because every person has a chelek in the world, a portion of the world that they have to work with. So when the Nefesh Elokis isn't removed from all of this, but is rather engaged in dealing with it, so then the whole person becomes a Mishkan and Mikdash for Hashem's light. And so that's the state and level and the place of the Nefesh Elokis where it has to be, that it doesn't just stay for itself and it's removed from the world, but rather it has to engage with each person within themselves in their Olam Katan, so that it could turn the whole person into a Mishkan and Mikdash for Hashem's light. Again, similar to the idea of the neck, that it has to be close to the body in order to affect and impact and bring down whatever the head has for the body. Now we're going to move on and explain another point regarding this story of Yosef crying on the neck of Binyamin and Binyamin crying on the neck of Yosef, and it's directly related to what we just learned. So according to this, we could understand why Yosef cried on the neck of Binyamin and Binyamin cried on the neck of Yosef. Because there is a difficulty over here, which is, why did each of them cry on the neck of his brother and not on the head of his brother? Since the head is the head as in the most important and greatest part of a person. And the reason is because the purpose of Yidden is like the Maimer Chazal of Ani Lo Nivresi Ella L'Shamish Eskeni. A Yid, a person is created for the only reason the person is created is to serve their creator, which means to complete the purpose of the creator in creating the person and all the worlds, all the Elamis, which the purpose is Lies Loi Dir B'Tachtenim. Hashem wants a dwelling place down here, and the making of this Dira depends on the Avodah of Yidden. It's up to Yidden, because it's made through Avodas Hashem, and Avodas Hashem is something which is up to a Yid, because Akol B'dei Shemayim Chutz Mi Yiras Shemayim, everything is in the hands of heaven except for Yiras Shemayim, which Yiras Shemayim is Reishis Avodah V'Ikra V'Sharsha. It's the beginning of the Avodah, it's the main thing of Avodah, and it's the source of the Avodah. So that's up to a Yid doing the Avodah, because a Yid has free choice. It's in the hands of the Yid that we should make the Dir B'Tachtenim. And this is done through each and every one being mizakech, refining and uplifting their body, their nefesh habahamis, and their Chelek ba'olam, their part in the world. And therefore the main thing in this regard is the neck. That in it and through it, this avodah is accomplished. It's through the neck, when the nefesh l'kis is engaged and working with the world, that we accomplish the making of the Dir B'Tachtenim. And now we can understand why Yosef and Binyamin cried on each other's necks and not on each other's heads. And it's for two reasons. Number one, there's no reason to cry on the head, the neshama of a Yid. When we're talking about the neshama of a Yid, the way it is completely elevated and removed from the body, there's no reason to cry for it, because the neshama of a Yid, gam b'shas hachet hoisa ba'omna ita yizbarach, the neshama of a Yid that's above the body, the neshama when it's in the state of a head, so that part of the neshama there's nothing to cry about, because it's always connected to Hashem. Even when a Yid is doing an Aveira, that part of the neshama is completely one with Hashem. And number two, the purpose of a Yid isn't in the head, which means the Avodah of the neshama for itself, the way it's on its own, removed and elevated from the body, but rather the neck, which that's the part of the neshama which is that affects one's body, one's nefesh bahamis, and one's part in the world. And that's why they cried on each other's necks. Number one, because there's no point in crying on the head. The head doesn't need it. And number two, that's the main purpose of a Yid, is the neck, where they work with the world and within the world to elevate the world and to change the world and to make it Dir B'Tachtenim. Now we're going to move on and ask two questions on this. The first question is, why did Yosef cry on the Mikdashis that would be in the land of Binyamin, and Binyamin cried on the Mishkan that would be in the land of Yosef? To the contrary, Adrabah, each one should have cried on their own churban, on their own destruction. Since Adam Karev Eitzel Atzmai, a person is closer to themselves, so the person comes first. And this idea that a person is closer to themselves is true to the extent that even by the mitzvah of Avas Yisrael, it's only V'ahavta l'reacha kameicha, and that kaf of kameicha is a kaf hadimyan. It's like yourself, but it's not the very same. It doesn't reach the extent and the depth and the amount of love that a person actually loves themselves. And like it's brought down in Igeras HaKodesh, that if there are two people and there's only enough water for one of them, so chayecha kaidmin, the person who has the water keeps it for themselves, because their life comes first. And the Alter Rebbe says this in the Igeres HaKodesh, where he writes at great length how much a person has to give tzedakah, and how important it is. In that very Igeres, he teaches that still chayecha kaidmin, that a person's life comes first. So we see a person is closer to themselves, so each of them should have cried for their own mikdash. And the second question is, and it's related to the first question, but it's on a different pasuk, on a different discussion, where it speaks about when Yaakov met Yosef. So the second question is, it says in the Zayar, on the pasuk of Vayipal al Tzavarav, Vayefk al Tzavarav Oid, that Yosef fell on the neck of Yaakov, and he cried on his neck more. So it says in the Zayar that Yosef cried for the Beis HaMikdash that would be destroyed. And based on this, the Zayar answers a question, another question on this pasuk of why it says Oid, and explains that it refers to the last Galus. And the question over here is, why did Yosef cry on the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash and not Yaakov? Why didn't Yaakov also cry? And the answer of Rashi in the name of Rabbi Seinu, that Hayakera Shema, that Yaakov was reading Shema, and that's why he didn't cry, it doesn't fit in the Zayar. In Pshutishal Mikra it fits, because in Pshutishal Mikra, Yosef cried because of his strong emotions. He cried because he finally met his father after being separated for 22 years. And so saying that Yaakov didn't cry because he was saying Krishma brings out and emphasizes the greatness of Yaakov, that even after finally meeting his son, after being separated for so many years, and when thinking that he wasn't even alive, nevertheless, he didn't stop reading Shema. And not only didn't he stop reading Shema, this great joy that he had didn't stop him from being able to say Shema with Kavanah. So that answers the question in Pshutei Shemikra, why didn't Yaakov cry? However, according to the explanation of the Zayar, that Yosef cried for the Beis HaMikdash that would be destroyed, how is it possible that Yaakov Avinu didn't get emotional and he wasn't disturbed and bothered through thinking and knowing about the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, and nevertheless, despite this, he was able to say Krishma with Kavanah? The explanation is, to answer these two questions, the purpose of crying is to make it easier for the one crying. Like we see that when a person cries about something that pains and distresses them, it doesn't have the ability to fix the thing that caused the crying, but it does release some of the pain. And like it says in Tehillim, Hoy salidi masi lechem. My tears were bread for me, which means that the tears help the person. They release some of the pain. And so from here it's understood that when a person is able to fix the problem, then to the contrary, they shouldn't calm themselves down with crying and then be less inclined and feel less of an urgency to fix the thing, but rather they must actually be involved in fixing the thing itself. And therefore, when a person sees the Churban Beis HaMikdash of another Yid, they join in their pain and cry. However, the main fixing and building of the Beis HaMikdash of that other Yid is not up to this person, but rather it's up to the other Yid. A person is able and obligated to help another Yid in two ways. Number one, through being mechiach them, directing them, correcting them, rebuking them. And number two, through being mispal for them. However, the actual removal of the averis and building of the other person's Beis HaMikdash is up to the other person who is a Baal Bchira. And after a person already did everything that they are able to do to help the other Yid, and they see that the other Yid's Beis HaMikdash is still destroyed, it will pain them and they will cry. However, when a person sees the Churban of their own Beis HaMikdash, so then they cannot be content with a sigh and with crying, but rather a person must fix and rebuild their Beis HaMikdash. And this is unless the crying is with tears of tshuva, which then the tears are part of the tshuva itself. But when there's something that actually has to be fixed, then a person can be content with a sigh and with crying. And sometimes actually the crying weakens a person's avodah to build their Beis HaMikdash. So not only can't the person be content with it, but it's even unhelpful because a person tells themselves that they did enough by crying. And according to this, we can answer our questions. Therefore, Yosef and Binyamin each cried for the Beis HaMikdash of the other and not for their own. Because for one's own Beis HaMikdash, one shouldn't cry, but rather one should act. And so too Yaakov didn't cry for the Churban Beis Hamikdash at all, but rather Hayakayre Eshma, because he is the father of all Yidden. And so the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash are in his portion. He's the father of all Yidden. And so for him, he shouldn't be involved in crying, but rather in acting and doing something, and he was doing something. Therefore, he was occupied with fixing and building the Beis Hamikdash. By Yaakov, not only didn't he cry, but he was actually occupied with fixing and building the Beis Hamikdash. How was saying Krishma, which is what Yaakov was doing? How is that fixing and building the Beis Hamikdash? The inyan of the Beis Hamikdash is, like the Rambam says, is to be a bayis muchan lekarbanos, a house that's ready for karbanos to be brought in it. And kol hakeirik Krishma. It says whoever reads Krishma, it's like they're bringing a carbon. So Yaakov was busy with building the Beis Hamikdash. And the inner explanation for why saying Krishma is like a carbon is because the main inyan of a carbon is Adam ki yakriv mikem carbon la'avaya. It's mikem, that a person brings themselves close. And that's like Krishma and the Mesiras Nefesh, which is in Krishma. That the idea of Krishma and the Mesiras Nefesh in Krishma, b'chol nafshecha, afilu neitalos nafshecha, is that a person brings themselves close to Hashem. And so Yaakov, not only wasn't he crying, but he was actively building and fixing the Churban Beis Hamikdash by saying Krishma. Now we're going to explain one last point about this story of Yosef and Binyamin crying on one another's mikdashos. And that is that you can't ask that since they saw in Ruach HaKodesh that the Mishkan and Mikdash will be destroyed, so if that's the case, it was already decreed from above, Milmaila, and so what can they do? It was already decreed. The reason you can't ask this is because Chazal already said, Afilu cherev chada munachas al tzavari shel adam. Even if a sharp sword is placed on the neck of a person, al yimna atzmei min harachamim. A person should not stop from asking for mercy. And even after a decree is already made, it was already decreed, it's possible through avodah to tear up the decree. And like we find, this is in Gemara Brachos, there's a whole story over there by Chizkiyahu, who was a king, that Yeshayahu gave him the nevuah that it was decreed upon him to die. And Chizkiyahu told Yeshayahu that Kali nevuoscha v'tzei, finish your nevuah and leave. Vayasev Chizkiyahu panav el hakir, and then Chizkiyahu turned to face the wall, Vayispalel el Hashem, and he davened to Hashem. And it says that his tefillah helped Shamaiti his tefilloscha, and he lived 15 more years begashmius in this world. So we see that even after there's an actual decree, a person can still change the decree and have it torn up. And so too here, there was a purpose in what they were doing because they were able to have the decree of the Churban torn up and removed. The Hira, the lesson is, Chazal said, Kol der she'enei nivna Beis Hamikdash b'yamav. Any generation that the Beis Hamikdash wasn't built during its days, Mailin olav ki'ilu hechrivoi. It's considered as if they destroyed it. And similarly, we can say regarding each person, the reason the Beis Hamikdash wasn't built is because one's personal Beis Hamikdash is destroyed. If a person's own personal avodah, meaning their own Beis Hamikdash, was complete and whole, so then Mashiach would come and build the general Beis Hamikdash. And the intent and purpose of thinking about this isn't to sigh and cry, but rather to act. And the act is to bring about one's personal geula and build the Beis Hamikdash in one's own nefesh. And that will hasten and draw down the geula HaKlalis and build the Beis Hamikdash in its place through Mashiach Tzidkenu B'Karev Mamish.